The following presentation was recorded live for the International Association of Square Dance Callers 33rd Annual Convention. We take you live to the Renaissance Suites Hotel in Charlotte, North Carolina, where our session is just getting underway.
Let us have your attention and we'll get things rolling. This is the Site Before Resolution panel. We are in Charlotte, North Carolina, April 10 through 12, 2006. Our panelists are Jerry Reed from Cocoa, Florida, also Executive Director of CALLERLAB, Activities and Fun and Games. From top to bottom, Mr. Jerry Reed. And on my left, from Nottingham, England, is Mr. Dave Clay. Dave Clay has been calling. Somebody told me that you were like a waiter at the Last Supper. Is that true? No. Dave's been calling 50 years this year.
Still trying to get it right.
Yeah. Those who didn't hear it, he said he's still trying to get it right. I told him we've worked together. It's working with Dave when he gets wound is kind of like being blindfolded on a roller coaster. But fun. We want to talk about what happens before we resolve when we're site callers. We also acknowledge and would like you to acknowledge that there are a number of choreographic management methods. You've heard said, actually, a number of you heard said in the panel earlier today probably, that some people who feel they are primarily exclusively site callers are actually using some other tools as well, and even if they're not necessarily aware of it. They find modules of things that fit together and take them places they want to be and so on, but they don't necessarily think of it as a module. We all use some level of memory. There are things that I believe over time move from our memorization category into what I call our knowledge bank, and that you can draw on and you can see things occurring because you've done them so many times. It's almost like muscle memory, only it's the brain functioning to see things. I'd like to talk a little bit first about what site calling, in my view, truly is. A little bit about what it is. I think it's a great way to be connected to the dancer, to see what's going on the floor, to be able to react to what's going on the floor. If we have one of those situations where there's a wardrobe malfunction happening before you start, you might give an extra time for somebody to get squared away before you start your sequence. It could also be somebody's having a problem in square. So you're very tuned in and connected. You're also connected to any funny things that might be going on the floor. It's also a dead giveaway if you've made a mistake. You know that real quick. Right? They let you know. So I like being connected to the dancers. I think that I can play more with the dancers, have a little bit more success when I'm connected to the dancers. Depending on which site method you use, and I'll explain that comment in a minute, it can be a fairly high-risk type of calling for yourself and for the dancer. There are callers that do not have memorized get-outs. They look for it all the time. That, in my view, is a danger. Either we extend things way too long while we're searching. All of you have danced to callers that just a little bit of time goes by and you suddenly know he's hunting, he's looking for it, right? It keeps it, makes it a little bit more difficult, I think is a better way to say that, to keep the continuity in the dance. It makes it, if you've got a theme for that tip, you have this issue all of a sudden that you wanted to do more, but you spent half your time searching for a corner. The high risk factor to you is embarrassment, not doing a good job, not being effective in your overall dance. The risk to the dancer is they're not having a very good time if they're breaking down or having to stop and say, hey, you can't do that. And we've all had moments. I mean, I wouldn't speak for you all, but I had one occasion where I was calling right and left through from lines of 4 facing out. I will plead, however, having just gotten off an airplane from Europe, and the jet lag hit at like 9:02, and we kind of brought it back. If you site call, another advantage, I think, to site calling is that it allows you to pay a little bit more attention to some of the sound issues. If you're scanning or reading material and trying to deal with the instruments for what you're hearing and trying to flip to the next item you're trying to do here, that gets a little busy. If you're site calling, and you're comfortable with your equipment, you can be tuning that as you go. If there's a change, whatever things need to be happening. The surrounding dancers you can interrelate to, as I mentioned. There's also an emotional thing that's going on the floor. What's the feeling? I'm sight calling. I can watch faces, watch for reactions. Again, you pick up on something funny that's happening, or in some cases something bad that's happened on the floor, and you need to be aware of that. So that's an issue that is in favor of being able to relate to the dancer and the dancer needs. Let's talk a little bit about what sight calling isn't. Sight calling is not, and never has been meant to be, a caller toy using live dancers as dolls. And we see that more often than I would like to think of. They're not puzzle pieces. They're people who are there to be entertained and enjoy themselves. If you're a sight caller and you want to work a program, you have a responsibility to have fluency in that actual approach to the activity. It's not the best choreo managing tool, especially for new callers. And we see this a lot. I think sight calling, having become the do-all, be-all for a long time, has done a lot of damage to new callers coming up. I don't want to see dancers having to wait while the caller figures out, okay, yeah, I can track 2 from here. Hesitating for the next call, even if maybe they know the next call, but they're waiting for the dancers to finish. Sight callers need to be, in my view, at least as an absolute minimum, and preferably, 2 calls ahead of the dancers. And you need to know what fits, so that when I'm calling, for example, double pass-through, what else can I call after that? And I need to know, and it has to be more than just track 2 or more than just cloverleaf. But I also need to know that because I need to be able to time the phrasing of that to the dancer so that they're leading one thing into the next. Sight calling is supposed to, and does, in my view, help improve the flow and the smoothness of the dance. But you need to know, and if you want to think of just 2 calls being together as a module, fine. Think of it as a mini module. But you need to know that they're there and they follow on without the dancers being waiting. And I see a lot of newer callers, it's too much work to go back and figure this all out ahead of time or to memorize it. At the risk of sounding like, the age-old man, when I started, I didn't even have checkers or dolls. I diagrammed every call. I would write out, here's a square through 2. Draw it. I would draw, here's a square through 3. I mean, tedious. But you learn where the calls go, where things leave you. You need to know where they start and where they end, but then also there's always the issues that we've talked about in other sessions, in the smooth flow sessions, smooth dancing sessions, about hand usage, about body flow action, one call leading to another. And then we've gotten a little more sophisticated, and we've learned that overflow can break down a square, not quite as quickly as bad flow, but it will still break a square. So being aware of those things. Another thing about sight calling that I don't want to see is a caller who watches one square. And if you'll pardon the pun, I think that's short-sighted rather than sight. That's dangerous for you. It's dangerous for the floor. Have I called and missed corners out there as a sight caller? Because I do a lot of sight calling. I have. And I have asked dancers, who's your corner? I've done that. And I'm not embarrassed to do it as long as I'm not doing it every 3rd sequence. But I'd rather not have to ever ask them at all. The crayons issue that went on earlier, I think it's very valid, it's very true, and it's something that every one of us needs to spend time on. I will tell you right now, I'm going home and I will spend time doing that. Did I know a lot of those things from over the years? Yeah, I've been calling 37 years. I've seen a number of those things, but beautifully packaged the way it was presented, and a lot of value in those tools. It's a lovely thing to have a safety net. Having a memory, however, is even better, I think, especially they were talking about the resolutions that they were going for. But what happens, before we get into that? What happens before we go to resolve? And knowing where dancers are, and where you feel they are, is very helpful. I can tell you as an early sight caller, when I first learned, I was like, man, I was like a kid with a new toy. I was bound up before and they cut the string to my kite, and I was just everywhere. It was great. And then I started to realize how dangerous it was. I will do one anecdote, and then we will move on to the panelists. But I was calling in Richmond, Virginia. Didn't know virtually anybody in the hall. Nice floor. We had about 16 squares of dancers. You might even have been there, Fred. I'm not sure. But I didn't know you then. But we had a 3-step stage, just short cafeteria. And I'm calling, and everything's going along fine. And then I suddenly realized that my 2 pilot squares that I had written down had gone to coffee early and without me. So I'm looking through the room, and I said, you know, can somebody give me a corner, please? I'm calling, they're dancing. Could somebody please give me a corner? They didn't know what I meant. Nobody had ever asked them that question. And in my frustration, I finally said, could somebody please point to your corner? And about 4 squares back on the left, a gentleman did. He pointed. You know, I said, God bless you, sir. Thank you. Now tell me who your partner is. Because I didn't know. Well, that's not the best impression. You know, it really isn't. And we do want to have more control. And we can laugh about it, you know, it's fine on the occasion. On the consistency situation of that happening a lot, that's not fair to the dancers. And you can be better callers than that. And I hope that, and I'm sure, that both of our panelists are going to give you some opportunities to figure out how to do that a little more successfully. That being said, I will pass this to Mr. Jerry Reed. Are you ready, sir?
Yes.
Jerry says, I'm all
I want to make sure the volume is pretty much the same. Before I get started, what I'd like to do is go ahead and hand these out. Mary, could you help? And what I'd like to have you do is just look at the back of it for now. Okay. What I'm going to try to do this afternoon is get more of a not really technical, but not really hands-on. I have some hands-on stuff that I'd like to perhaps show you later on, but not for right now. What Mary is handing out is a form that I use, and if you look on just on the back there, it's the form that has all the lines and such. And John was talking about keeping track of who your corner and all of that business is, which is extremely important for me. The method I use, I like to call it site resolution. I pretty much freewheel during the site before I get to resolution, and then start to resolve. John did mention calling right and left throughs out of facing out lines. I listened to a tape one time, and Jack Lazary said he had gotten in that position, and he merely said from the right and left through, and then noticed they were in back-to-back lines and said, after you bend the line. And like John says, those type of things are okay on occasion. Obviously, you don't want to do that every other call. But this tip plan, I call this my tip planning form, and I double side printed. It gives me enough room for 6 tips, which covers a 2-hour dance. And just the brief description of what I put in there, I put in the tip number. I usually go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because that seems to make more sense than anything else. I put in, before I got one of these little timers, I got a timer from Radio Shack that I push when I start to keep track of how long I'm calling, because I don't know about you, but sometimes I really get, the dancers are really hot and going, and I'm feeling good about what I'm calling. Everything is rolling smooth. I may tend to go, 12, 13, 14, 15 minutes with pattern. I don't want to go that long, so I have my timer. Before I had the timer, I would put in the time that I started and the time that I stopped. I really don't use that anymore. If there's some kind of a theme that I want to use for an opener, a grand square, or some other type of opener, plus perhaps a teacup chain, I'll put that in. If there's some kind of a closure that I'd like to close the theme tip with, the same type of thing, a stir the bucket tip perhaps, or some other type of closer, I put that in there. And then I have spots for 3 key and corner. That would be my key man and his corner, and that's the way I learned to. When I got into this business, site calling was pretty well rolling pretty long. That was in the late 70s, and site calling was pretty rolling along pretty good at that time. So I didn't get into much memory of. One thing, I found it very difficult to memorize that stuff, and so most of what I do is sites. So I key on a key man and his corner. This allows me to mark up to 3 squares, which usually is good enough, especially if there's only 1 square in the hall. But what this does for me, I write them down, and I actually do that. In fact, for the groups that I call for all the time, I write those down. What I have found over the years is just the fact of writing it down is enough, and I never have to come back and refer to it. So it's just a little crutch that I use. And then there's spots on there for up to 8 entries, which I also believe in theming a tip. Sometime I will theme a tip around formations. I want to use diamonds, or I want to use stars or lines or whatever it might be. And sometimes I theme tips around types of calls, ocean wave calls or column calls or diamond calls. So that might be a theme also. Also, sometimes I theme around a kitchen sink. I just, all kinds of things. If I've got to a point where I just want to use stuff that I haven't used all night, I may change that program and just say, well, I haven't used any certain calls for a while, and certainly not this evening, so I just throw those in and try to work that. I don't particularly like that system, though, because I do like to have some kind of a theme, either formation theme or some kind of around movements. And on the other side of, and if you want, you certainly take this, and what I do, I double copy that back page so that it's back to back, and like I say, there's enough spots on there for 6 tips. I do like the theme tips, as I've said, and I use this tip planning form to do that. One of the things about the site calling and pattern calling in particular, and this is from the front side of the handout. I'll try not to read it word for word. But when I first got started, singing calls are certainly important. I enjoy doing most singing calls, but I have to admit that I enjoy pattern calling much more than I do singing calls, except the ones that I've already recorded myself, of course, and those are the good ones. But as it says there, I believe that pattern calling is where the rubber meets the road when it comes to a square dance caller. A person can get up and memorize a singing call and do a wonderful job at it, and always find the corner, and always come out right, and always have perfect timing in a singing call. But when we get to the pattern, that's when the rubber meets the road, as it is. What I'm trying to do in this handout is to cover just the main points of some of the things that I believe are important when we begin studying the skills that are required to do pattern calling. And of course, the end thing that we're trying to end, the end product that we want to end at the end, the reason for that we do all of this work and all of this study and attend these sessions is so that we're able to call interesting, smooth, comfortable. And also I include somewhat challenging choreography. I used to correspond with Bill Davis too. Oh, crap. Bill, if you don't mind that ringing, I'll just leave it. But with Bill Peters, and I always remember Bill Peters' philosophy was that one of the highlights of dances that he always thought was when we're able to bring the dancers just to that brink of disaster. We just bring them right up to the edge and then bring them back without having them fall over the edge. And he didn't call every tip that way, nor obviously not every sequence. But throughout the evening, there would be sequences scattered throughout his choreography where he would just bring the dancers to the brink of disaster and then bring them back without letting them fall over. And he felt, and I do to some extent also, that is part of the fun of square dancing, depending on the group. And that is also an important consideration. I've called for clubs which it took 3/4 of the way through the record to get one square on the floor because they were visiting, drinking coffee or having some cake or whatever. They weren't there to square dance. They weren't there to hear me call or voice and do magical singing calls. They were there to visit with their friends. Square dancing just happened to be an opportunity for them to get together. So that at that group, I never did any of this brink stuff. I'd call pretty straight up stuff. And as it says in there, bring those people to the brink and then not letting them fall over is not an easy task. It also says that getting them to the brink is very easy. Not letting them go over, that's the challenge. And sometimes it says there that we get them to the brink and we're not sure why. We get them to the brink, they fall over, and we don't know why they fell over. And that's really bad. We need to know how to get them to the brink, why they're at the brink, and even more importantly, perhaps to keep them from going over. We must know the skill. We must know not only the skill of the dancers that we're calling to, but also the preference. As I mentioned, there are some social groups that don't want any challenge at all. There are other groups that if they're 100% successful all night long, they feel that I have not called a good dance, that they have not had a good time, because they are looking for challenge. And they enjoy challenging choreography. Even if they fail, they can enjoy that too, as long as they don't fail all night. Because if they fail all night, I certainly have failed all night. And as it says there, this task of knowing that skill and their preferences is not easy, because on the same with the same group on different nights, they're going to have different preferences, and it's up to us to judge what that preference is. And I am always concerned when we talk about caller judgment. That is such a difficult thing to quantify for sure, and certainly a difficult thing to learn and to establish. And I'm glad that you all are here. It shows that you certainly are interested in this subject. It's not an easy thing to learn, and as it says there, the lack of that skill is what many caller trainers believe is the failure point of learning callers. Let's see. And toward the bottom there, each time we call a dance, we need to judge. And it says with reasonable accuracy for sure how those dancers are going to judge the difficulty of what we're calling and why they perceive different things to be different or difficult, and why they perceive things to be perhaps other things not so difficult. And again, with the same group on different nights, that mix can be different. So we need to be aware of the perception that the dancers are feeling for the choreography that we're calling. And I agree wholeheartedly with what John says, is that through sight calling is that real connection that we have with the dancers. You can maintain eye contact with them and see whether they're smiling or whether they're frowning or whatever it is. And I may begin calling a tip, and that I'm planning to go. I never plan to go more than 10 minutes, usually between 5 and 10 minutes. If I'm doing a singing call, it's even about 5 minutes or so. But if I am about halfway through where I'm planning to be, and I hit a point where I do a what I call snapshot resolution from some magical thing that is just wham bam, and they go wild and they're screaming and hollering and just having a bang old time, I will stop right there and say, you know, bow to your partners in corners and take a break, because I've got them as high as I can get them in that particular portion of the evening, and take a break right there. And again, be aware of the desires of the group that you're calling for. Not too hard, not too easy. That is one of the most difficult things that we can do as callers, is to determine what that mix is. I have a little saying there, and I have this posted on my practice turntable, and I carry it around with me also. Short tips are not always outstanding, but outstanding tips are always short. In order to do site calling, site resolution, we must become very familiar with formation awareness, to know what formation the dancers are in, what can be done from that formation, and as important as that, where they're going to end, and as John said, to be a couple of calls ahead of them, to know what they can do from wherever they're going to finish that particular call. I believe it's as important to know what should be called as it is to know what can be called, because as you know, if we're in a boy at a typical plus dance, at least the typical plus dances that are within my experience, but if we're in a boy, girl ocean wave at a plus dance and call follow your neighbor, we're going to have a significant amount of breakdown, at least for the dancers that I call with. It's certainly possible to call follow your neighbor from there, but should I? And unless I'm workshopping or working a theme and working them up to the point where that would be successful, I would never call that particular sequence cold unless I were calling to John's dancers, and then I wouldn't worry about it. The importance of knowing those things at the bottom there, body flow, timing, being able to work with a musical phrase, and knowing which calls are going to seem difficult and which calls are not. And CALLERLAB has a sheet that's called Call Analysis Sheet, and it is good exercise to go through the calls that you're going to use and fill that sheet out, and it'll tell you which hand is available at the end of the call, what formation it starts in, what formation it's going to end in, and that is extremely good information. I started much as it sounds like John did, at least when he was starting to learn or work on site calling, and that's diagramming. Excuse me, one of the very first, I learned in the Philippines in a very isolated area. I was pretty much by myself, and I got all the textbooks I could get. One of them I got was the fundamentals of, I think it was called The Fundamentals of Hash Calling by J. King. And I began to read that, and I got through the first chapter, and from then on I had not the slightest idea what it was trying to tell me. However, in that first chapter, he did talk about diagramming, and I did exactly the same thing that John did. I would diagram every call all the way through with all 8 dancers. And as I began to learn more and more, I said, well, you know, I can diagram just half of the square and be able to track what's happening on the other side of the square as long as I use symmetric choreography. And I still use that method today to check choreography. If I want to create some theme tip or some special get out or some kind of gimmick, that's what I still use. I've got Caller Angels, but I still put pen to paper to and figure out. And one of the things I like about it is you can actually see where the dancers have been, not only where they are, but where they have been. I have some samples of some of the, just a couple of the theme ideas that I do use, but I will hold those in case we have time at the end, but I don't have a big plan to use those. Any questions or comments? Oh, okay. Oh, microphone. Thank you, Mary.
The question I have is, both of y'all made the comment of you could make eye contact better when sight calling. Why do you think that you cannot do that just as well with module calling if you know your modules?
With modules, you certainly could. However, there are times when I have a particularly complex and difficult sequence that I know the dancers are going to have difficulty with. I will, in fact, actually read it. And with that, I find it very, I mean, obviously, it's really hard to maintain contact there. And you're absolutely right that with modules, certainly then, and I use a lot of modules, you know, head square through 4. That's a memorized sequence, or, you know, it's also a very short module, too. But I have a bunch of those little modules, too. I mean, we all do. You know, swing through, boys run, Ferris wheel. You know, we all use that. Well, most of us probably do. You ever use that? It's something I've researched just here at this convention, so I'm going to try to work that in. But you're right, with modules, as long as you know your modules and are there. And here's John.
To follow on to your question, it's perfect segue, as they say in radio, to another aspect I wanted to address. Your comment is perfect. We all need to find what works for us, and I said earlier that I would talk about different types of sight calling. One of those types I refer to is sight timing, where I'm watching the dancers, I'm timing to my music, I'm phrasing to my music, but I'm watching the dancers to see what's going on. You know, we have the luxury in patter if we have to give the dancers an extra beat because they're beginning to falter. You know, we can do that. We don't have that luxury in a singing call, short of changing the figure. But when you're doing sight timing, you support that with memorization for those who have good, strong memories and feel comfortable with that. The modules, the zeros, the equivalents, those things are all working that way. Some folks effectively use mental image. I really don't know but one caller that I've ever worked with who truly will call an entire dance, an entire weekend, with pure mental image. And what I mean by that is they are tracking the magic square in their head. And this caller can also pay attention to the floor at the same time, although he doesn't always look like he is. You know, I'll see him be looking off this way, but he's peripherally over here. He has a peripheral sense of movement in the room in case there's a problem, but he's tracking that square. I mean, I've watched him process some very long, very, very long and relatively complex sequences that way, and very successfully. It works for him, but very few of us seem to be able to do that. It's a unique gift. There's also, as we learned earlier today, people who are using CRAM's approach, and an effective tool, as Jerry pointed out and John pointed out and so on this morning, been around a long time. You know, the elements of that have been around a long time. But if you're working those items, you can then readily be connected to the floor, without a doubt. There's also what I like to think of, that we all agree that square dancing is a language. When you become a competent sight caller, then for you, you have conversational sight, for want of a better term. It's knowing the language, you speak the language, it's immersion. You hear people that go to a different country and they're thinking in that language. You know, they're not trying to translate this word to that word. You know, it is just pure, straight conversation. That's the language they come comfortable to speak, even though it's a second language. And with site calling, I believe that's true. And our languages, of course, are calls. They are call commands. Certainly, we do augment that with, if you will, adjectives such as helping words. To get a dancer from point A to point B, if you see a situation where you can use helping words, and I'm site calling, I have that ability to offer that little extra, whether it be the extra beat or the extra reminder of how a call might be starting if somebody's faltering. But the people who site call well can talk to you in choreography just as a sentence would be in your native tongue. And you feel that way and you think that way, and then it begins to smooth things out, particularly if you've paid attention to the mechanics that we talked about before, you know, the hand usage, the body flow, the preceding and follow-on calls. I guess an analogy is to a good speaker, you know, a communicator and an entertainer. They can put them all together, but you're doing it with square dance calls and watching the results, and you are responding to the results as well, just as you would in a conversation if somebody was talking with you and you respond back because you see what's happening on the floor. Maybe your response is, oh, we better do that again. You know, maybe we'd take another look at that. Or, you know, maybe so your response internally might be, good, next step. They like that. Let's do more of that. Let's do something else. And it's a back and forth in that way. There is also what has been referred to as extemporaneous sight. This doesn't happen a lot. It's basically kind of going where you have never gone before. You are out, you are calling, you're moving along, you see something occur, it strikes a chord in your mind. And I think that happens when you have reached the stage of being very, very comfortable in the conversational sight. When it is your second language, you've made it your own, you're not struggling at that point, you're not thinking about rotation, because I believe when you sight call to dancers and you're working with good music, you take the dancers on a journey. And I think that's the way to think about it. The dancers are going for a ride. I'm the driver. I'm taking them on a ride. I'm taking them on a tour. And I'm letting them move and enjoy the music and enjoy the choreography as much as is possible, helping them to do that. And when it's time to think about the resolve, I will do that. But once you've become that comfortable, there will be times when you see something that's an idea that has not occurred to you before. And you'll go in there, and you may not know. And then we talked earlier about risk, and that is a risky thing to do. I think people will do it more readily at home than they will out at the festival, or when you have your one-shot tip at the state convention. You know, that's probably not the best place to go exploring extemporaneously. But it's neat. Or if you can, jot down the idea at the end of the tip. If my memory doesn't always last that long, it works better if I've actually seen it happen and we'll jot it down. But those types of things, I think, are different types of sight calling that we get involved in. So measure yourself a little bit in your sight calling by how is the floor moving. That's a great aspect of knowing, am I really sight calling? Or am I arriving somewhere just in the nick of time, possibly thinking of a next call? If you're working memory and module, chances are that's not a problem. But if you are truly sighting to what's occurring on the floor and being ahead of the dancers and where you want to take them on that journey, there will be good, smooth flow that way as well. But you need to know that. So I've seen in the last 3 weeks, 3 weekends in different places across the country, California, Pennsylvania, Jersey, I've seen guest callers call. And admittedly, some of them were newer callers. And we cut tons of slack to new callers. It's a hard thing. We all remember that, getting up there. And if there's any new callers in the room, and I happen to know there are, you know, it's tough. It's a tough deal. There's a lot of things, a lot of balls to keep juggling in the air all at the same time. So how do you get there? But I'm seeing callers that have been effectively told, well, the best way to do it is sight calling. That's the easy way. I've had it happen in caller schools. We'll give them a little homework assignment. Come back tomorrow. You know, show us 3 ways to get to a zero line. Lines of 4 facing, everybody has their partner, everybody in sequence, and you can't use heads lead right and circle to a line. Just come back with that homework assignment. And you'll find people come back the next day and say, it took me an hour and a half. It took me 2 hours. And that's just to get to a line. There's got to be an easier way. What about sight calling? It should not be sight calling. But, well, let's explore that. And I'll ask them to come up, and I'll put a square on the floor, and I'll say, Okay, let's try that. Do some sight calling here a little bit. Let's see how it works. Let's understand how it works. And of course, they're pretty good. They start off with a singing call sequence that they have memorized, and of course, as experienced callers, we recognize when that's happening. And you stop them about partway through. And I'm not talking about resolve now. I'm not worried about resolve. And I tell them that also. So you don't even need to think about resolving. All you need to do is move the dancers for me. So I'll stop them in the middle of that singing call pattern that they've memorized. And I'll insert another call. Nothing tricky, nothing unique. Just put in another call, maybe 2 calls, and say, okay, here we go. Drop the needle and pick up from there. Well, you can imagine what happens, because it's right and left. No, yeah, you can do that. All right, right and left through, pass through, and of course, all of you that have ever been a newer caller know what it feels like when the square or 2 or 4, whatever you're lucky enough to have, is standing in front of you, and they turn around and they look up because they're waiting for the next call. And of course, that 3-4 seconds is like an hour and 18 minutes, in your brain at that moment in time, and it's tough. But sight calling is no way to start. You really need to know what the calls do in terms of starting, ending, and what they do physically to the dancer. I just can't stress it enough. It is not a shortcut. Having said all that, I'd like to turn the program over to Dave Clay from Nottingham, England.
Thank you, John. I'm almost exclusively a sight caller. I go down the dangerous route, and I've probably made more mistakes than most by doing it. But it's worth the cost at the end of the day. But there's no shortcut ultimately for knowing what the choreography does. That's the most important thing. You won't be an effective, fluent sight caller until you know where your calls are taking you or where they're taking the dancers. I'm not necessarily saying you've got to know every position in the square of every person, because obviously you wouldn't know that. But you've got to recognize that you're going to finish in a line of 4, facing out for the next call, and not call right and left through, although we've all done it, of course. After bend the line, of course, which is very well known as the delay concept.
Let me leap in. I just had to share this with you, too. I was at a dance one time, and Flippo, and anybody doesn't know who that is, you haven't been dancing nearly long enough, because you haven't been dancing a week yet. But Flippo did that one time, and the floor was in the typical uproar, and he just said, I wasn't done yet. And, of course, Flip can get away with anything.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you for that interruption, John.
Do you want to use my notes?
Yes. Yeah. There's a big difference also with using sight calling for your clubs, and I suspect that most of you are actually club callers. And if, in fact, most of us spend most of our time calling in the club. Am I right? Yeah. And we're probably calling to the same 16, maybe 24 people. Week after week after week, we're just left there to wallow away. And that's when sight calling has its greatest strength and its greatest gift, because you can explore with those same 16 people without spending hours and hours and hours of research in the first instance. You can take them either by running the same routine sequences, or you can use APD sequences. You can experiment with having the 2 boys and the 2 girls together quite easily. The only danger with over-practicing with your own group is if you are fortunate enough to go out to a special, or call it a special, or call it a festival, is not to expect those dancers at the festival to be able to dance the same way as your dancers can do. And it is one of the big mistakes we make. We're so familiar with them reacting instantly to what we call. Like John was saying, I think it was John, about Jerry, the 2 boys together, follow your neighbor. Now, if you live over in England 30 years ago, we were dancing boy, boy, girl, girl, follow your neighbor all the time, because we taught by definition. We're encouraged to dance by definition. And we didn't have any difficulty. We saw that as our norm. The very first time I called in the States was up in Kansas City. And I think the temperature was about 100 degrees on that day. There was no air conditioning in the hall, although the windows were open. This is the first time I'd ever called in the States. The guy says, we're going to a workshop. He says, okay, you're on, Dave. Just like all my caller friends do. They say, you're on next. They don't give you any preparation. And it's a workshop. And I'm scared stiff. I've never called in America before. Okay, and I'm hot. And we get tight. Suddenly, everything goes very tight. You know, you can barely move your microphone arm. John's talking about eye contact. I don't want to see anybody. You know, my eyes go blurred. And that's another technique also. If you're having problems, being able to put your eyes out of focus is very useful sometimes, because you can look at somebody, they think you're looking at them. And God, he's friendly, but you've got a blur there, you know. And I got up there and I called sort of head square through, for swing through, follow your neighbor. Crash. Boy and a girl going in. We don't do it that way. We have to have 2 boys, 2 girls going in. Now, it didn't matter whether you were sight calling or whether you were reading from a sheet of paper. Boy, you were in trouble with everywhere, because every square went down. But if you were sight calling exclusively, and you had still got a couple of squares left, but they weren't the ones you picked, then your sight square is gone. What are you going to do then? You know, you could have potentially a real problem. How many of you actually do sight call? Hands in the air. Okay, how many of you don't sight call? Oh, right, good. Does that mean you memorize your sequences, or you read them from a sheet? You read from a sheet. Taking. Okay. Different. You've got a system. Yeah. Okay. As I said, I'm almost exclusively a sight call. I use the mirror system. I mean, I found it miraculous in 1963 when I met Les Gocher for the first time, and suddenly found turn around, Alaman left. You know, and I was never so excited in all my life. And then to find also, you didn't have to know everybody in the square. You slash it down the middle, take 1/2, and whatever happens on that side, happens on that side. It doesn't in mine squares, mind you, but we hope the same thing happens. You know, it's great if the mirror people are on the good side. You know, some strange reason they always end up on the bad side, and the corner never comes back into the mirror, and this is really worrying. But it's a great tool, and it gives you great flexibility, particularly if you're working with beginners. I mean, I was thinking when we're talking about length of tips. You know, I was admiring your 10-minute tips. Or was it 5-minute tips? Whatever it was, 10 minutes. I wish I could call a 10-minute tip. You know, I really do. And then you wish I did too. All right. And then my mind flashed back to SQMP3 and Dave Wilson. What was it? Said his timer, was it at 12 minutes? Or no, for 14 minutes. If anybody calls a tip longer than 14 minutes, you're in the wrong business. But there are times when you need to call long tips. If you're teaching beginners, you may want to concentrate on long sequences. You know, you keep them standing. I mean, I've seen tips last 45, 50 minutes in a teaching context, not necessarily a dance context, because, you know, you're running through, and maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you shouldn't. I mean, okay, we should keep it to a reasonable length. But you have that flexibility to do it. That's the most important thing. You don't have to have a long sheet of instructions. You don't have sort of page. Imagine how many pages of calls you'd have to have for a 45-minute tip. It's a lot.
Well, if you write small.
I mean, even if you write small, it's still an awful lot. So using sight calling in that context is extremely useful. But it doesn't negate the need to understand what you're doing. To understand what you're doing, to be able to deliver it in a fluid way, to deliver it in an interesting way to the dancer, so that in such a way that he'll actually believe that you are competent in what you're doing. And if you're a new sight caller, you won't be fully competent. You will not. You have to spend a lot of time. And you're going to have to blend the systems you use. You're going to have to use some written material. You're going to have to use your imagination. You're going to have to use modules or whatever, or you may just use some simple get-outs. But you're going to have to add into it. You're not going to get away with just sight calling. Okay. If anybody sees sight calling as an easy way out, I know I did in 1963. I thought, this is great. You know, I've got sheets and sheets of paper I had to memorize, because in those days, you did not put your call sheet on the stage. You know, it was not acceptable to use call sheets. Much more acceptable today. I think it's a great idea, personally. I think we should have big lecterns or even prompt screens up here, you know, and take out... Am I preaching heresy? Yeah, well, karaoke, yeah. We'll give the dancers a map. Great idea. But you see far more use of call sheets today. And if your technique's good, you can get away with it. I mean, if you look at the challenge callers, the really good callers who use sheets, they read very well. They're not following each line like I do, you know, sort of pointing down like a kid reading a page. So all these things will be useful to you. But one of the other big values I've found with sight calling as well is use of singing calls. How many of you use your sight calls for singing calls? One or two?
In an emergency.
In an emergency.
Yeah. That'll change the number of hands real quick that went up. Yeah.
What was the emergency, John?
You've misspoken. You know. You knew you.
Okay. Well, this again is where the good use of sight calling will aid you in this. And one of the good ways to do it, one of the useful ways of doing it, is to actually run your sequence, your singing call sequence that you think you might get away with the dancers in the patter tip. Very useful way. Just toward the end of your patter tip, set them up and do it, call it, see how it works out. You might be workshopping a new call or whatever the case may be, and you might find that it doesn't come out very easily in 6 to 8 lines of call, in which case you probably won't go any further because you're not going to work it out and remember it. But quite often, if you sight call a sequence, it can very frequently come out in a neat position. So if you feel you need singing call sequences without reading them or memorizing, then do it in the tip. Run a short sequence and see how you get on. Okay. The other opportunity, as we're talking about teaching, is that repetition. You have the opportunity to repeat calls when you're teaching. You can repeat them over and over and over again until you're ready for resolution. Great, great tool. Timing your calls in sight calling. Now, there's one problem here. We were talking about eye contact and whatever. What I think some callers do, and I know I fall into the same trap as well, is I tend to time to one square that I'm looking at. Does anybody else do that? Okay. You get tunnel vision. You've got this square down here. It's your comfortable field of vision. And it's also the number 1 couple is dressed in red and number 4 couple is dressed in black, which is also very useful. So you're focusing on that one all the time. And sometimes it is actually obvious to the dancer that you're favoring that square. But also look back sometimes. Call to that square and then change the square you're calling to. This square dances perfectly. You notice that? The one you're calling to almost always succeeds because you're timing it to them. Now, the square down here, number 2 and 3 square over here, they're struggling either to keep up or they're dropping behind. They're dancing too slowly. Switch your square from this square over here to this square over here and start calling to that one. You suddenly find this square over here is not as good as you thought it was. The moment you've taken your focus off them, then they have problems. So I think what we're saying there is don't get tunnel vision and concentrate purely on one square. Dot around your squares for timing purposes, not necessarily for resolution purposes, because if you're calling sort of middle of road timing, you'll probably find that square still there at the end of the day. Okay. And if you have real problems, then I think you should give all the dancers numbers when they come in so they can hang them on the back. And that makes sight calling much easier when it comes to resolution. The opportunity to give the element of surprise. The element of surprise. Great for a dancer. it's not so great if you're the one that's surprised. So, again, be careful. You know, if you're really motoring on and you call something, be prepared to get a surprise. They may not know what you're doing. You may not find they've been taught what you're calling. So be prepared to get a surprise from time to time. I shall look down at my notes now. The caller knows that a certain call will work. He knows it will work perfectly. It's technically possible. But he often has very little idea the degree of difficulty from the dancer's point of view. How many of you actually dance as well as call on a regular basis? Well, the hands go down when you say regular basis, as we have only so many. Doran, did you say that? Right. It does pay to dance, if only from time to time, just to get back to getting a feel of what it's like to relay the Ducey with 2 boys and 2 girls. You know, because most dancers dance by a sort of telepathy, almost like whales following in the sea. They know where they're going. They don't measure it. Like you say, to relay the Ducey 5 parts. Well, a plus square won't do that. You know, they don't know there are 5 parts. There's only 1 part to relay the Ducey, and it starts with the boys on the end, and it finishes with the boys on the end. And don't try changing it, kids, because that's against the rules. My club's called Dial A, and we call this the Dial A syndrome. It doesn't matter what position the caller sets them up in, they know the ending position. Boy on the end, girl in the middle. And they don't care. If you start it left-handed, they'll make it right-handed. They know you've made a mistake.
Sure, they'll fix it for you, won't they?
Yep, they'll fix it for you every time. And you know, all your dreams are down the pan. You spent the whole night before working out all this wonderful material. And this is even with your own groups. These are my groups. People that have been taught in my own classes. Well, you go and try and do something they don't want to do. And they won't do it. And they'll correct it for you. They're very, very helpful dancers, very helpful. When I was listening to John, I thought the ideal thing, just to sort of throw out to you, is we should have 2 callers all the time. This is an interesting one, okay. Because one can be doing all this sort of free-range calling, but the other one's keeping track of the square. And when you've done all the free-range calling, he resolves it for you. How about that? But you could change over alternate sequences, couldn't you? Anyway, let's try that. Okay. Useful practice as well, if you have got 2 callers for your sight calling, is to alternate calls. He calls the first call, you call the second call. He calls the one, so on and so on. That's a good way to expand your ability to call a call free-ranging. I think this has also been said already, but in different words, and I wrote down here, don't call it because you know it. Call it because they know it. I know it sounds obvious, but I've always been a bit of a rebel. And as I said, what do you mean always been? Did I say been? I am a rebel. And I've always felt, you know, I could do anything and just call it and without regard. But it is important that they can do it. And years ago, I got the impression, probably for about the first 10 years of calling, that the caller was actually there to help the dancer. But it seems to have faded. Now we talk about challenge and we talk about variety. We don't really talk about giving the dancers clues anymore, like forward 8 and back your reel, pass through and bend the line. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? And roll, of course. I forgot that. But yeah, must roll. But we have stopped helping the dancers. And I don't think it matters whether you're sight calling or whether you're writing your own choreography. But I think maybe, including me, we should go back to helping the dancer to dance. You will enjoy it more as a caller the more successful they are. Thank you.
Good. Wonderful. I got some good stuff off of that. Just a few words as
By
John,
the tape.
as John was speaking, and also Dave. And Dave at the end mentioned cues and helping words, and I do use a lot of helping words, and sometimes depending on where I'm calling and the type of material I'm calling, but people will ask me, don't use so many cue words. But I picked this up at one of the CALLERLAB sessions one time, the difference between cues and clues, at least in my mind. Cues I interpret as letting the dancers know what formation they're in. In your left-hand ocean wave, left swing through, or in your boy-boy, girl-girl lines, wheel and deal, or things like that. And clues I interpret to be parts of the call itself. With your left hand, left swing through, or with your left hand scoot back, it's a left-handed ocean wave. This cues and clues to, as Dave says, help the dancers succeed, because I view that as my job, is to entertain the dancers, but also to help them to succeed. Dave also mentioned long tips, and I agree also, and especially in a teaching situation, my 5 to 10 minute rule goes out the window, because I often call, in most of the teaching tips, I call longer than 10 minutes, and especially if I'm teaching something quite difficult or complex. I don't think there are any difficult square dance moves, although I do believe there are a lot of complex square dance moves. And so if I'm teaching a complex square dance move, and I always teach, whatever I teach for the heads until they've practiced it sufficiently, I think, and then I teach it for the sides and go through all of that also. So some of those tips do, in fact, get long. And also, I like what Dave said, too, about in the teaching situation, sight calling I have found is very, very helpful, because you can come back to that same call each time. And what I try to do when I'm teaching and using sight calling, I'll use the move wherever they end. As quickly as I can, I get them back, and hopefully in the same footprints they were at least for the first 2 or 3 times, exactly back in the same footprints, call it again, and then leave them in the same relative position, but in different footprints, and call it from then. And with sight calling, I've been able to modify what I do. If I had it all written down, I wouldn't be able to do that. I'd have to go through my whole written down sequence. And even with modules, I found myself a little bit restricted there also. But with sight, if they breeze right through the first part that I've got, then I move right on to the next part of that. All of this comes down to formation awareness. If we're not able to set up a particular theme, you might want to look at working is having from a starting double pass through position all the boys in the middle or all the girls in the middle. And it is an absolute requirement, I believe, in my mind at least, for all of us to be able to set up any of those formations and arrangements that we want to work. And the only way I've found that I was able to do that is to diagram it out and see what calls are going to put me, what happens to the square once I start calling. I agree also with, I think it was probably David and John both that said sight calling is not really for new callers as a beginning way to start. I believe modules are extremely important, and even the reading if you have to get you started. Now, when I first started, I read a lot of what I was calling. And what I've also found is that as I'm calling, if the dancers miss something that I've said, or if part of the floor misses what I've said, especially if it's my pilot square or 2 or 3, I resolve as quickly as I can and get everybody back. And I don't know how many, maybe with a show of hands, how many of you, when the square gets messed up, wrong partners, wrong corners and all that, how many of you ask your dancers to, when they get back home and get ready to start again, ask them to repair, to get back with their original partners and original corners? Do any of you? Okay, a little over half. Okay, that's I feel good about that, because in many places that I've called, callers don't do that. I mean, they don't care whether if you're back with original partners, original corners, and that makes it tough on me, because then I gotta jot down who the who the new key people are, and then they change back, because they will repair it on you for sure. But I like the idea of 2 callers, and I really like Dave's idea. One can just out there freewheel and then say, "Here's John." Get out of that. But formation arrangement, formation awareness, I believe, is really a key. You have to have a good basis of formation awareness to do any of the site calling stuff we're talking about here.
Sorry, go ahead.
Terry Lewis from Nova Scotia, Canada. I've heard, and I just want your opinion on it, as to longevity of square dance callers. If a site caller is apt to stay in the business longer than a module caller, or I forget what the other type was, the snapshot type.
Okay, I'll be one to respond to that. I really don't think the choreographic management technique that you employ has a thing in the world to do with how long you'll be calling. I think how well you use whatever methodology you've selected, or combination, which is really the ideal combination of methods that you use, will make a big difference. And I'm very fond of saying, because we all know that we have a diminishment in our numbers and we're trying to work on that, but I have always said, if you can teach well, you'll always have somebody to call to. And I believe that. I don't care if you can't sing. I don't care if you can't always get the corners back, but if you can teach well, there's always somebody who'll be willing to learn from you.
I was a bit concerned when you talked about longevity of site callers. I can think of many occasions when the dancers would easily have strung me up. But Jerry made a point earlier when he was talking about assisting the dancers, and it leads me into an interesting anecdote, but giving clues, like saying begin with the right hand, or right and then left. Square dancing's a language. It is a language. It is a discrete language. The other bits are English. Well, some of them. Okay, the other bits are English. Now, if you're calling in a different country, then offering those assisting words can be a distraction. If you're calling Sweden, Norway, Germany, they will not thank you for additional words because they can't separate them from the language word. Same as using too much leading, trailer, filling patter. You have to be very guarded not to put that in because, as I say, they can't separate the word. But the anecdote I was thinking of is, don't ever assume that your dancers can speak English. I made this mistake some years ago when I went to Texas. And I've got my dear friend with me from Texas here today. But to imagine that Texans speak English is a big mistake.
There's one thing I need to jump in here. I think it's important. This is important that you all know. As you can tell, Dave really has no unique accent. Well, at home, he has no unique accent. Here, of course, to our ear, he does. But it's quite fascinating. Dave does not call here or at home with a British accent. He does not. He learned early, I mean, way early on, it was like purely an American activity. So I assume he either chose to call as an American would sound, or Melton told him if he didn't learn, he couldn't come visit anymore. I'm not sure which, but it's really unique. But when he stops to teach, the accent returns. And there's only an occasional slip. I mean, the groups at home, at my groups where Dave has called a number of times, they're still working on Hoff square through. They're not quite sure what Hoff square through is, but they'll get there, I just say, do less, and it seems to work for them. Jerry, you had a comment?
Yeah, just on the cues and clues. A danger that creeps into my calling sometimes, because I do, as I mentioned, do use a lot of cues and clues. Occasionally, not often, but I will use a particular call which might end with the centers doing a cast 3/4, and I'm kind of cluing through, and at the end of the thing I say, girls cast 3/4, and I'm to this square that I'm kind of watching here, they do it perfectly, and they're in this ocean wave that I wanted them to be in, and I look up and there's a square back there and facing diamonds. I say, how did they get there? Well, they finished the call, and then I told those centers in that front square to cast 3/4, and the back square did. And all of a sudden we got these facing diamonds. What the heck am I going to do now? Too much is not always too good.
I think that helping words are very important, but they're also extremely important that they do not break the flow of the dance. They're there to help the flow of the dance. So where you place them and how you place them becomes very important over time. And we've seen this before. I don't want to stop the floor up. But let's say I'm going to call a reverse flutter wheel, and I've given the command, and I see even a hint of hesitation. I may well say, depending on their arrangement to begin with, but I may well say, boys by the left. But I've already given the command to start the action, and I've thrown that out. It's almost a little reminder. They know flutter wheel. They know reverse flutter wheel. But sometimes, but I'm watching the floor so I can see if there's a bit of a stumble. It also comes back to not only in teaching, but in your actual dancer's functioning. If you're sighting, or if whatever method you're using allows you to be visually connected to the floor, you can begin to see where they're having a problem and why. After a period of time, we grow to understand, gee, I know that this is going to be hard for them. I need to watch carefully, or I need to give them a helping word. Sometimes we don't necessarily know why they broke down. It's like, especially if you're calling someplace you've never called before, particularly, you don't know the dancers, and you walk in, what did I say? You felt like you were throwing hand grenades out there. Just, what? Well, if you're watching carefully, you'll begin to see that. And as you study your calls, you also begin to understand why certain calls, or what parts of certain calls are harder than others. Our standard applications book is very helpful in that, particularly in our mainstream and plus, that will give you a good, solid approach to the best chance of success in how to do these calls. But while you're learning, while you're teaching particularly, is what I meant to say, the new people, you need to know where they're failing. You need to know what they're not hearing or seeing. Everybody learns, every one of your dancers learns differently. Some learn audibly, and what you've explained will work. Others will learn tactily by having actually danced it and gone through the moves. Some will learn visually by seeing how a call works from the outside of the square. Those make a difference. I wanted to ask a question of our two panelists and anyone else who would like to play. How do we decide what to sight call? Now, Jerry mentioned themes, but how do we decide that? And we have a hand up, so I'm going to let the mic go there while these two guys prepare to answer the question I didn't tell them I was going to ask.
Dorn McBroom, Maryland. It feeds right into the question that I had, and that's particularly for the new guys. Don't assume that sight calling is a magic solution to be able to call. I've been sight calling very effectively for a very long time. I still write for almost every dance that I call. Those that I don't is leftover choreography from the last dance. So that's how you decide. You write it ahead of time. You know what you're going to call before you get there.
I guess my answer to this trick question is, I guess I really don't understand the question, but yeah. I really site call everything except gimmick get outs. I love gimmick get outs. My problem is I never can remember them. I mean, I've got about 3 or 4 that I remember, but after I use those same 3 or 4, like the 20th time in one tip, they say maybe I really shouldn't do that. So I do write those down, and I actually do read the gimmick get out stuff. But I do cite everything else. Well, I hate to say that I cite everything else, but because I don't. Because I know that if I am in an ocean wave, a right-handed ocean wave, or if I'm in facing couples, and I do a swing through and the centers run, I know I'm in a two-face line, and the couples circle, I'm still there, and a Ferris wheel, and and I can mentally follow all of this stuff also. So I feel that I'm using it like all of it, because I do write stuff. I read that. I use mental image because I follow up to track all this stuff in my mind, and also cite, because I think it was Dave that mentioned experimenting, and I have found myself, I mean, things are going really well, and I just started experimenting, and pretty soon I look out there and these dancers are in some weird formation that I've never seen before, and then I've got to try to quickly recall how I got them there, and more importantly, how to get them out without being so difficult that they're not successful, because I do believe that the dancers should succeed. Did I stumble through your question well enough?
That was fine. It was interesting, and let me shift here, Mary. I had written down about 10 minutes ago and had circled it on a piece of paper. And Doran's talking about how I led right into what he was going to comment on. And what I had written and circled is right for sight. You need to know what things do. You also need to know what you want to do. And you can theme a specific call or a combination of calls, but at the risk of getting stale by always site calling the same things over and over again. And I'm not talking about creative, in-depth choreography. We can do that. That's a separate topic. But you need to be fresh. You need to not always call the same patterns. You can get smoother calling a lot of the same patterns repeatedly if they are good in the first place and you are good with your music. But at some point, for both the dancer interest and your interest, but we often have heard Jim Mayo, for example, talk about different, not difficult. And that keeps some freshness. And if you can use a note service, fine. But if you do that, push your checkers through everything that they send you. Make sure that it works, it flows, it's comfortable. Make sure you understand it. But you want freshness in there. It's also good for you as a caller. You become a better caller. You continue to keep some level of excitement and interest in what you're doing. But I've said this, and it's kind of ironic because most of you know that I call, across the board, and I do call some of the challenge material. But I will say it, and I've said it before, choreography is not the do-all, be-all of square dancing by far. Movement to music, enjoyment of the people is the do-all, in my view. That's why they're there, is to have a good time, be entertained. Choreography is one of our tools, just one. But right for sight, I think, is really important.
Terry Lewis again from Canada. Like I did like Jerry, I work it out with pawns beforehand, and I know that result, and, so I know that what's going to happen, it doesn't fall apart at the time. But to hear some talking about writing it down and then calling it sight just doesn't seem to jive with me unless you're not reading it while you're doing it. And also, if you get a function that's outside in a windstorm, then that's gone. What I do, I diagram new ideas, and I track as I am diagramming. I also track it in my mind so that I get a mental image of what's happening to the square as I diagram it, and I very rarely, in fact, I don't ever think I ever have
actually called a sequence that I have diagrammed out, other than one of those gimmick get-outs. But I diagram so that I can see what happens to the square. I can see, you know, are we boy, boy, girl, girl, or to get the feel for the formation awareness, and then I will transfer that feeling, that knowledge into a site to eventually site resolution, but for the site calling. So I get the ideas for what I'm going to do, formation awareness-wise, by diagramming, and then I apply that as I'm calling.
Yeah, when I say cite for write, write for cite, I'm not indicating you should write it down and carry it to the dance and read it, because that's the only way you can do it. I am talking about, you've heard us refer to mental image, and all of us actually use some of that at times. We will use it in discussions in the hallways right here, and in almost every panel. You know, somebody will say, okay, I've said head square through 4, swing through, boys run right, you know, where are we? Okay, but that's fine, but I've done that 18 million times. Well, what else could I do differently? And if I'm sitting there with my dolls, times. We will use it in discussions in the hallways right here, and in almost every panel. You know, somebody will say, okay, I've said head square through 4, swing through, boys run right, you know, where are we? Okay, but that's fine, but I've done that 18 million times. Well, what else could I do differently? And if I'm sitting there with my dolls, with a diagram, whichever, and I'm moving those things through, I always offer 2 questions in my caller schools. You know, you ask yourself these 2 questions before you move the dolls. First question, what happens if? What happens if I call this? What happens if I call that? Right? And the second question is, what else can I call? Both those questions before you move the checkers. Right? As you do that, you will find yourself discovering some freshness. And I'm not saying you should come with something brand new at every single dance. You know, this is something you grow into because you still want the tried and true. You know, our dancers do very well with muscle memory that helps them carry them through and continue to feel like they're dancing. But from a standpoint of freshness, unless you're going to pull it out of midair, you know, you need to have some sources for that. You can provide your own source very often with those 2 questions, and also it makes you understand the things you're going to call more readily. You know, you're much more comfortable with them.
Yeah. I might be able to make it easy for you because I have a lousy memory. Now, it's funny, you ask any caller if he's got a good memory, he'll tell you he's got a bad memory. But in actual fact, they've got good memories, a lot of callers. And some callers have got outstanding memories. They can remember almost anything. And that's what makes them outstanding callers. We're not outstanding callers. We're callers who enjoy calling and enjoy giving the dancers a good time. If you've got good sequences written by a good caller, don't deprive yourself of the opportunity to use them, or the dancers the opportunity to dance them, just because you've got to read them. Learn to read them effectively. I'm not saying memorize them, because that's our problem. We can't memorize them and get them right in a lot of cases. But you can learn them and be familiar with them. They become prompts. You're not literally standing here saying, head square through 4, and then do, touch a quarter, follow your neighbor. Oh, have they gone? You know, you're not actually doing that. You develop a technique for reading from a cue card, if it's well written, and you're just glancing at this from time to time. It's not a great big long sequence. That's the other thing. It's going to be a fairly shortish sequence.
While the microphone's traveling back there, I would mention that I don't use the term reading. I use the term scan. You know, you scan if you're working from paper, but that's an art. It's an art form, and you get better at it at times, and it's something you need to keep a handle on. But one last thing what Dave was talking about, if you've copied out a really good sequence that you dance somewhere, again, push your checkers through it. Make sure you understand it, make sure you're comfortable with it, and make sure you believe you can deliver it successfully because it's an appropriate sequence for your dancers. Yes, sir. Identify.
Wayne Jansen, California. And there's no reason for me to say anything. He just did it.
Rats. Foiled again.
No. Not right. I don't know if any of you knew Jim Mork that worked for Hilton, but he had a shorthand system. And I use that shorthand system, and you're really not reading, per se, heads promenade. You just put H for heads, prom, bump, 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 bump. That's all you got to do is glance. And it helps me. I've done it now for 40 years. And, you know, if I lose it here, I glance, and I can pick it up right away. Come up with some kind of a shorthand situation that, you know, you don't need to have to read every word.
The comment was made earlier that when some of us started a long time ago that you did not read. You did not have papers in front of you. You had nothing between you and the dancers, and it was considered unprofessional. Well, we know to a great degree that has gone away. I won't use any names, but I will tell you that, and it happened in Europe, and there was an American caller there who uses written material, uses the material extremely well. Writing easy is a very, very hard thing to do. Just when you get sitting there and you start pushing and writing it down, and it looks so straightforward, and you get to the floor, and it's way harder than you thought it was. But this particular caller has that gift, and also has the gift of being able to present that material without anybody feeling like it's being read to them. Very, very fine talent. At a caller's clinic, one of the callers challenged this caller and said, yeah, but that's not professional because you use notes. Well, put yourself in that caller's position. You are a guest. You've been asked to talk and teach about what you do and how you do it, you and two other callers. And somebody you don't know has risen from the floor to challenge your approach. First, I will say to every one of you, you do what works for you and does no harm to the dancer. That's important. Are there better ways? For some people, yes. For some people, no. I was very, very pleased to see how that was handled. Another local caller stood up and said, excuse me, Mr. Guest Caller, I'd like to ask you a question. Yes. How many festivals and weekends do you call a year? Approximately 40, 42. And looked at the other local caller and said, and how many do you do? Then they moved on to the next subject, of course. Use the tools that are effective for you. Develop what tools you can without doing damage to the dancers. You need to use tools that help them as well. And there are lots of tools, but sight calling is not the do-all, be-all. And Dave looks like he has a comment, and Jerry?
Yeah, I got a comment here, quick one. I'll come to you then. Okay. One of the biggest mistakes the inexperienced sight caller makes, and I went through the exactly same thing, you forget to look at the square. But you can't sight call. It doesn't work because you won't resolve them. So you either carry on, call a wonderful sequence, and then say, find your way home. So that's the first thing. Remember to look at the square. The second one is, if you have difficulty remembering the squares, write them down. And I say that I didn't believe this for years, because again, I was brought up in the school where there was no paper. But I had a top international caller called a dance for me, and always beware of the caller with his briefcase. You've all seen it. He's got his briefcase on the stage, and the back of it is turned toward you. It's his box of tricks. Because in there he's got his cue cards and he's got his pieces of paper. But this excellent caller was doing this, looking. And I found the papers when he'd finished, and he'd noted the corners down. And I thought to myself, why am I worrying? This guy's a top international traveling caller. He can do it. Well, why can't you? You know, and he needed to do it to be successful, so you can do it. Okay.
Michael Malton from Chicago. Get my own name right. Question from long ago. Someone made a comment that I just wanted to ask a little bit more on. I'm a newer caller. I said call a fair amount, and mostly it's at advanced and C1. How to not give one call at a time when sight calling. I know in theory I should be thinking 2 calls ahead, as someone was saying. How is it just experience, or are there things that I can do for myself to develop that?
write for sight. You sit down and you say, what calls go together? Get a tape recording of a caller who you appreciate or a group of callers, and if you have to transpose it, then do so. But look at what fits together and memorize, there it is again, or jot down these little modules of things that fit together. You know, we had the pleasure of dancing to you last night. You know, we were in one of the squares, and you called interesting material. It was appropriate material. One or two things, the zigzags always is a floor stopper, but beyond that, I only say that because I didn't get it right. The point being that, but you didn't have that movement and flow of the answer that you would have liked to have had. You know, and I understood what was happening. But the idea now is that you go back and you say, okay, after track 2, what can I call? What, you know, give me 5 things that I know that would fit nicely and wouldn't be reverse body flow, wouldn't be overflow, and put that down, and then maybe add one more call behind each one of those. And do it linearly, you know. So here's my relay to Ducey or whatever call you happen to do, and then the next one, this will fit really well with it, this will fit really well with it. And then you can do one more column and say, you know, and that gives you basically the call and then 2 after. You also, at some point, are going to need to be looking at the calls that precede, just so you have the smoothness, not asking for reverse flow. It requires homework. It's just plain and simple. You got to do homework. We have one more question. Okay, quick to that.
Just a very quick one on that one there. Is take a tape of another caller and transcribe it. Transcribe it word for word. Run it through SD, run it through whatever choreographer program you've got. Run it through, study it. See how he's fitted the things together.
If you went out this weekend to see and hear the North Carolina Symphony play orchestra, how many members of the orchestra would not have a stand up there with music to read?
Good point. Would not. How many would not? None of them. Yeah. Just to finish up here, before John gives our closing remarks, follow with me mentally, if you would. We're in a static square. Everybody's at home with partners. Heads star through and spread. Pass through. Wheel and deal. And just in your own mind, do you know where the dancers are? Okay? Then just in your own mind. And then that was head star through, spread, pass through, wheel and deal. And just in your own mind, we won't ask who does and who doesn't, because I don't have any idea. And also, another one for you. Another one, sides lead to the right, circle to a line. We're all in boy, girl, 0 facing lines of 4. The front-facing girl and the back-facing boy. That's the girl. That's the girl that's looking at you and the boy that is looking at her. Front-facing girl, back-facing boy. Pass through. And where are you now? So I'll give you that one more time. Sides lead to the right, circle to a line. Front-facing girl and back-facing boy pass through. And just in your own mind, or maybe diagram it out to see where you are. No. What I mean is the front-facing girl. There are 2. Well, okay, I'll buy that. Front-facing girls and back-facing boys pass through. And as in your mental mind, I'm sure you know now that the boys are in a right-hand ocean wave and the girls are in a left-hand ocean wave. And you can do all kinds of choreography out of that. And then at the end, undo what you did by setting up either a left-hand wave or an ocean wave. Either set up either the girls or the boys in a left-hand wave and then do the same thing. The people that are facing past her. But just a mental image to follow in your mind. And here's John to wrap up.
Those types of exercises are fun to do. If you're traveling with another caller, you can do that. Actually, Doran and I did that many years ago, and he was well ahead of me. We would start that, da-da-da-da-da, where are they? And, you know, and that would be fine. I was good for 2 calls, you know. And, you know, but all that being said, there's a lot of stuff we've touched on, and you notice a lot of things overlap into other fields, you know, of study and calling. It has to. It's all integrated. We want to thank you so much for coming in. Have a good coffee break. Have a good convention. We'll look forward to seeing you on the floor. Thank you so much.